The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 1. Chapter 1. Arrival. 1. The envoy walked in moonlight. His heavy boots scuffed the dark red surface of the barren desert for the 13th night since he crashed there. The huge silver disk above him shone so brightly that he could see everything as though it were dusk or dawn. Dust, sand, and rubble made up the floor of his current stage, and except for the occasional rock or, less commonly, boulder, nothing else. Nothing lived on the stony tract around the envoy, but a light breeze spun up devils of dust and sand across the landscape. Droplets of sweat stood on his forehead, and every icy gust reminded him he was losing precious water. It was midnight, or around midnight. The horizon to the east and west was an abrupt line between burnt orange land and starry black sky. He maintained his gait, trudging eastward, but questioned his course.
Maybe I stop for a minute. Maybe I think about this.
His new home was a lifeless rock orbiting a new star, and the air was acrid and painfully low in oxygen. He winced when he inhaled and felt a sharp bolt of pain cut through him from deep in his core. He was dying. He needed water, and he needed food.
Soon. Tomorrow.
The dark brown canvas bag strapped to his back weighed on him. He could not remember a time it felt heavier. To the north, the view did not differ from the east.
But it might be cooler,
he thought.
The days might be shorter.
He had observed the celestial activity with scrutiny since the moment he landed, and expected the northern hemisphere to be edging into winter.
It's worth a shot.
Changing course presented little risk, so he hiked his bag up on his back, turned north, and walked away from the ever-changing faces of the moon. The enormous white fixture in the night sky was new to the envoy. It was so bright that if he started walking while the moon was up and before the sun went down, his body would cast two shadows, a sharp-edged, crisp shadow from the sun and a dim, less defined one from the moonlight. The only other features in the sky during such an event were two pins of light, one pale blue, the other a deep orange. Planets. The closer of the two, the pale blue, was already awash in water, but it did not qualify for his mission. It was much too small. Its mass could not sustain a core that would block the solar wind for long, and he needed time more than anything else. It was his fifth mission, his last. The first four planets had nothing like the bright white satellite. No such large moon filled the night sky of the others except Vasir, but that was a small, irregularly shaped body that orbited Distria, his first mission planet. Otherwise, all the skies were a cold black except for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of stars. Walking at night was far preferable to day. The daytime landscape would shift and shimmer in his squinting view. The heat of the day was too much to bear. Direct sunlight on his skin stung and left visible redness and inflammation wherever it touched. Most of the other worlds he visited had been much further along when he arrived, except for one. He arrived on the planet Telraid the same way he arrived on the fifth planet, and was grateful. It helped him to prepare his mind, body, and resources for the fifth, his last. The first stage on Telraid had been a living hell. It had been the most painful, torturous time of his life. The experience, though, had trained him to prepare for the worst. His fifth planet was Earth, but he did not know that yet. He landed on Earth barely after it was born. It had only just begun cooling from a molten blob, freewheeling around the infant sun, its cataclysmic meeting with Thea only a 500 million years before his arrival. The envoy was searching for a cave, a semi-permanent shelter that could protect his fragile body from the elements for millions of years. He had no guidance with this task. There was no formula for telling which place would work and which would not, but he had no other choice. His ultimate goal was to wait for the intelligent life that would likely evolve, and he would need a safe place to put himself while those countless years passed. He walked north for 2 more hours and looked for shelter. About 300 yards ahead there was a large, round boulder, and he aimed for it. The massive rock had to have been 15 feet high and would provide the desperately needed shade. Over his shoulder, he peered at the eastern horizon. It was getting brighter by the minute as the planet's star ascended. 2. The envoy slept for 4 hours. The sun had made its way to the western part of the sky and was at its hottest. His throat was drying out, and a stitch had formed in his side. The combination lifted him to consciousness, and the moment he awoke, he drew in a deep, hard breath that carried with it a significant amount of dust. It triggered a spastic coughing fit that did not stop him from launching out of the hole that would have been his tomb if he did not move. He dug his sleeping holes down only 18 inches when there was cover, nothing like the graves he would dig when he had nothing to shield him from the sun. When he emerged from his hole, the sun's light immediately stung his forehead and cheeks. The bright white glare off the land stabbed him in the eyes, forcing them instinctively to snap shut. A second later, he could feel the searing heat on the backs of his hands and neck. There was one word in his mind, and it was screaming, "Cover!" It was not the first time this had happened. The problem was simple. He had overslept. He would normally have prepared by making a thick shroud from his supplies to provide a temporary but effective shelter as he evaded the sunlight while traversing the boulder. There was no time for that. He briefly opened his eyes only long enough to locate and grab his bag with one hand and his dark blue, nearly black blanket with the other. He reeled and ran doubled over so his back would take the bulk of the fire from the sky until he reached the other side of the boulder. Rounding the corner, he gasped when he saw the wide strip of shadow there. He had really overslept. He dove into the darkness to get out of the bath of radiation emitted by the young sun. It turned out to be a mistake. In his urgency, he had forgotten that the ground, sand, and bits of fragmented rock in the precious shade had been baking recently in the very sunlight he was trying to escape. The stinging pain tore through the palms of his hands and the side of his face, and soon after, his chest, gut, and legs. At once he rolled onto his back and pulled himself into a desperate fetal position, trying to tuck every part of him deeper and deeper into a ball and away from the madness. After a few minutes, he could not bear the pain another moment. Being careful to maintain his position, he settled on his side in the spot that had already had most of its thermal energy removed by his badly burned back. He laid there with his eyes clasped shut and his face buried in his crossed arms for over an hour. When he lifted his head, the greater part of the heat had subsided. He had to drink. The constant straining and squinting to bring anything at all into focus had given him a headache. He was hesitant to go to his pack for any of the consumables contained within, but he would not die there with a bag full of life-sustaining supplies either. He always tried to wait until just before sunrise to drink. The water was always coolest then, but he was feeling the pangs of organ failure. Pain twisted through his guts. He was lightheaded, and his vision was as bad as he could remember it ever being. The water was warm and unpleasant. It did not slake his thirst at all, but rather aggravated it. He daydreamed about what it would be like to drink ice-cold water and the pleasure it brought with it. His logical brain knew that drinking the unpleasant water was beneficial to his health, but at that moment, his stomach hurt, and he was afraid that he might vomit the precious substance up. Eyes closed, he placed a hand over his mouth, clenched his jaw shut, and swelled his tongue to the back of his throat, waiting for the nausea to pass.
Keep it down. You have to keep it down. You can't waste any of it.
It took an unnerving amount of time before he felt comfortable removing his hand. He had consumed about half the bottle and stowed the rest for later that night. His water supply was getting dangerously low. He coughed hard. The air was exquisitely dry. He imagined the only moisture in the air was that which came from his breath and the vapor from his sweat. Water was not his only need in that moment. When the nausea passed, the screaming hunger resumed. His food was limited, and he had eaten only twice in 14 days. But it was time again. He had dried meat, each piece about the size of his thumb. He tore open the plastic packaging of one and picked it apart, eating slowly to avoid losing it to another round of nausea. With the morsel of food consumed, he closed his eyes and leaned back against the rock face, hoping he could achieve a state of half-consciousness that would allow for the time to pass more quickly. It took almost an hour, but his mind flitted between true wakefulness and the beginnings of shallow sleep. It was in that state that he imagined Orris, the vast machine world in interstellar space that was the single most massive, daring, and unbelievable project undertaken by living beings in universal history. The images in his mind were the product of his imagination. Orris had only been a hollow ring of framed material orbiting his home planet when he left so many ages before. In his mind's eye, a brilliant network of pulses and flashes of light sparked along its complex network of artificial gravity cylinders, nuclear power plants, and antimatter storage tanks. It was a structure as long as an inner solar system was wide, collecting resources and preparing for its ambitious effort to escape the collapse with its precious cargo. 3. When he awoke, the envoy was pleased to see that the small shadows on the ground cast by stones and small rocky outcrops had stretched. He sighed, and a smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was not lightheaded, and his vision was sharper. The pain in his gut was still there, but it was more of a hunger pain than a pleading, dying, desperate pain. To the north, the horizon appeared a deep indigo, and it was hard to make out the line where soil met sky. As his gaze moved back to the ground in front of him, an alarm rose in his mind. His more sensitive peripheral vision had picked up an irregularity at the otherwise smooth joining of earth and sky. When he looked back up, he did not see it. He stared. It was there, not due north, but close. A touch to the east, the envoy saw a peak.
Target acquired,
he thought. He did not stop walking for almost 3 hours. The air had so dried out his eyes that they were again beginning to blur and sting.
Rest, at least for a few minutes.
The pain in his legs, and especially his calves, was quickly developing from an irritant to agony. He stopped and dropped his gear to the earth beside his left boot. The respite from the weight of his bag was welcome, and he laid down on his back. Eyes finally closed, the relief was immediate. He knew the comfort was temporary, and that if there was going to be any genuine, lasting relief, that he would need to get up and move. At almost the same time, the wind rose and stole his breath with its acrid dryness. He sat up and pulled the collar of his shirt out far enough to plunge his face into the large opening. He breathed deeply of the damp air there created by his sweat. The odor was sour, but the physical relief in his nasal cavity and throat more than made up for it.
Get up.
He drew one last deep breath from his shirt and stood.
Move.